Welcome to Everlutionary, a podcast about how we can restore balance and heal the world. Every episode of my show, we explore the future of humanity and how we've gotten to where we are today. Through inspirational stories about healing, science, and mysticism, we'll see how we can reshape our society to create a world free of violence. I'm your host, Hawah Kasat. Peace, 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 y'all. Welcome back to Everlutionary. Thanks for tuning in. We have a really special episode today on the heels of the U.S. presidential election. Now that that's behind us, we have a lot to unpack and unravel. And today's episode, we're having a really inspiring and deep conversation about post-election burnout and planetary health, how to build bridges across differences, how to regulate our nervous systems, how to stay anchored in the face of uncertainty, and we're sprinkling in some existential reflections on this moment in human history. And so I'm really, really excited that we're joined today by a special guest. Her name is Nivi Jaswal. She is a visionary who has traversed from the corporate world to the heart of community and health advocacy. Through her remarkable experiences and profound personal losses, including the loss of her father to COVID-19, Nivi has shaped a mission that transcends boundaries and disciplines. Nivi's global perspective was cultivated through her work and travels to over 45 countries. Her work, it threads cultures and traditions while addressing the modern crisis of health, planetary food systems, and sustainable living. Nivi is the co-founder and president of a nonprofit in the greater Boston area called the Virsa Foundation and its Divinity Research and Advocacy Program. Her research not only uncovers the links between diet, burnout, and global pandemics, but it also seeks to inspire actionable change towards a more equitable world. So really excited to be bringing this conversation to you today. Hold on tight and buckle in. Nivi, thank you so much for joining Everlutionary Podcast. Thanks for making time to be here with me today.
Thank you for having me, Hawah.
It's so great to have you. We are going through some incredibly transitional times here in the United States of America. I know you're based in Boston. Right now I'm based in California, and the U.S. presidential election has just ended. And I'm wondering, just kind of starting, like, how are you feeling? What's on your heart? How are you waking up on these mornings right now?
Wow, that's a really significant question. And thank you so much for asking. It's a very compassionate question too. I think that personally, first of all, I'm so glad that the frenzy in the run up to it is done with, right? A lot of the times there's a lot of anxiety in the anticipation, and the process in and of itself carries so much anxiety. So it's all done now, and we have, wherever the chips have fallen. And so we have that amazing opportunity to look at where we are as people, where we are as a community, as a culture, as a country, as a nation, as a world, and what are the implications for the work that's cut out for, each one of us going forward, regardless how anyone voted. So I do feel a sense of relief from that anticipatory frenzy that seemed to be kind of floating in the ambiance, in the run up to election day. And now that we have what we have, I'm reflecting and I'm pausing and I'm taking this week off. And literally the only thing that I'm doing is this soulful conversation that I have an opportunity to do with you and hopefully feel energized.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I'm glad to hear that you're taking a beat and you're taking a breather. And I hope all the listeners that are tuned in right now, wherever you are, you're being compassionate with yourself and taking a breather taking a moment to pause and rest as you need to in the spaces that you need to be in. It's an interesting time, right? Because while we're kind of living in these extremes and polarities of emotions, right? I mean, I really appreciate you speaking to just how, well, the deep anxiety of anticipation is over. And there's a lot of people around the world that have experienced a lot of jubilation and joy over the election outcome. I want to name that, right? And I also want to name that there's a lot of people that are experiencing a lot of loss and grief and sadness and depression from the election outcome in the US. And both of these are happening at the same time. There's loss and there's a feeling of deep disappointment. And then there's the feeling of great victory for a whole nother part of the population. And it's amazing just the extreme polarities that exist within the collective. Because I hear the word collective a lot and like, oh, we're collectively feeling this deep grief. And then I sometimes think to myself, well, the collective is feeling actually deep grief, but the collective is also feeling deep joy. Like it's actually a narrow way to think of the collective as just the whole collective is grieving, because that's actually not the case. But are you, in your days, are you feeling sadness? Are you feeling disappointment? Are you feeling joy and jubilation? And which way and why?
Before I actually respond to that, I wanted to share that there is duality to the human experience, and with naming and recognizing the fact that there's a distinct half amongst us that might be experiencing a sense of loss. And then there is another half. Since it was a dead heat, very closely contested election. And then there's the other half that are feeling joy and maybe a sense of relief that, whatever their side was is won. I just want to bring ourselves back to this sense of knowing that I know every single one of us has, that there is a duality in the human experience. So I'm experiencing both. I'm experiencing the relief, as I mentioned, from this contest, very public, very international contest, just being over and done with at this point in time. And the other part of me also feels a sense of trepidation around what is it that's ahead of us. I feel disappointed. No one's perfect as a candidate in any contest, right? And it's always a measure that people take of, benefits to them or possible potential benefits accrual to them in the near future to the costs that they're willing to accept. And from where I stand, I think that regardless of whether someone voted red or someone voted blue, there are certain costs to those significant decisions that are just too hard and too big, too large for us to ignore. And one of those, and I know, as this conversation goes through, want to talk about and get more into detail, but just to mention the big costs to our environment, the big cost to our climate, the earth and the burnout that the earth is feeling at this point in time, regardless of, which way we are, whether we are, more to the left or the right or the center or, either way, a tornado or a hurricane or flash flooding when it occurs, it really, really doesn't care about our political divisions because they're so human-made and in that sense, so ephemeral and so transient. And so just a blink of an eye in the larger geological cosmic scheme of things. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think that I just, wanted to acknowledge my own feelings of dual experiences and also acknowledging the people out there and their duality that we see around us.
Right. No, I mean, you've touched on so many important ideas that I think we'll be digging into over the course of our conversation. And the idea of burnout, no matter where we are as humans, I love the way you've been framing planetary burnout. And you wrote about this recently on a post that you made on social media about planetary burnout. There's personal burnout, of course, and I think we should be discussing that at some point here about like how there are so many people in the community that are feeling just burnt out. And it can be from this election cycle. It can be from losing. It could be even from winning, right? Even winners get burnt out. Let's talk about that. But then there's planetary burnout as well, where, you're speaking to something that I feel needs to be really understood in a way that's accessible. So what do you mean when you say planetary burnout as opposed to personal burnout? And I know you've been talking about karma as well a little bit, and the karmic debt of what we are experiencing right now. How are you threading these together as ideas that are helping you understand the larger expanse of what's happening in this moment in time in human history?
Yeah, that's a great question. Ever since the pandemic, there is a lot of conversation around burnout because people are experiencing that intense sense of grief, uncertainty, loss. And so to understand that at a personal human level is far easier because you immediately, have resonance with that idea. And in the work that we do at my nonprofit and also in my own personal reflection to help me, sense of what's going on and what is my own purpose in this world, I feel that we as a human species, we're both mirrors, of what's happening in the environment. And we also have a causative role in affecting it because we're a fairly special species, and then we have an ability due to our prefrontal cortex to be able to manipulate our environment and create structures and have abstractions or abstract concepts and project those up there and turn those ideas into manifest reality. And even though we play this causative role, we're also mirrors. And when I look at a tree, when I look at the sky, or when I look at images of catastrophe, which we all agree has intensified in the past, years, and the frequency of it has also increased, the intensity of these wildfires, out in the West, or flash flooding, or, golf ball sized hail just falling out of nowhere. In fact, just this morning, I woke up to the news that snow has fallen in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in the Middle East, traditionally places that we associate with really hot and dry weather and certainly not snow type of precipitation, that they're experiencing snowfall. So when you hear and see of these different things, I feel that, our sense of burnout as people, it's also being mirrored by other living beings, around us that are non-human living beings. And frequently we get caught up in this treadmill of our own lives and our own inner thinking and our, red versus blue and then that sort of thing, that it's actually a very good time to just pause and to understand how what we're feeling inside is also what's happening outside, and that there is a planetary dimension to it. So to talk about those things, I mean, we can go into the science of it, and frequently when I've talked about it in very evidence-based ways, and there are frameworks that scientists are using to be able to decode the understanding of planetary boundaries, planetary burnout, planetary distress that is being experienced at this point in time. And yet we feel that a lot of that scientific communication fails to land with people. And even if it lands intellectually, it fails to land, within their heart chakras where we need it to land, because our purpose can only, find resonance when we've viscerally absorbed the facts of what we're being told. And if we don't, and if it just stays here and if it hovers here, then there's a lot of vulnerability that we as humans have to suggestion, to disinformation, to misinformation about climate change and these sorts of things. And that can express itself in the form of climate change denial, which we know was part of the decision making for a lot of people,
And continues to be for some people. And, when we live too much up in our heads and we try to mentally wrap our heads around what's happening, we sometimes lose sight of how we're feeling it in our hearts. And I think what I'm hearing from you is there's a need to really connect also viscerally to the experience that the earth is having also. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about. It's just the earth, of course, as a living organism that is experiencing its own changes and shifts, which are in a reciprocal sort of relationship, cause and effect relationship with our own actions and behavior. And it's hard to separate those two. When you are talking about planetary burnout, are you seeing the planet being burned out like by what we're doing to it? Or do you think the planet is burning out as in like the Gaia theory, the Earth has its own living organism? Which way are you kind of interpreting the burnout that the planet is experiencing?
Yeah. And to be clear, I think it is the former at this point in time, at least, in the geological history Earth and how our planet has, formed. It's formed out of the Big Bang and, with the universe. And then there's a lot of chaos that potentially ensued with that. And our Earth bears the scars and the marks of it. We know that. And we do have a lot of scientific evidence that has been collected, continues to be collected to reveal, how chaotic and how tumultuous the history of our planet has been, was, and could continue to be. However, there is a difference in how geological cycles and planetary cycles affect the Earth. And then there are anthropogenic factors that impact the Earth. And the scientists tend to call it, and they refer to it as the age of the Anthropocene. And what it really means is that the age when human beings have started to play a causative role in what happens, not just to microclimate around us, but to really affect global planetary systems that make the Earth go round, And when I say that, I'm talking about our oceans, the health of our oceans. I'm talking about the quality and health of our air. I'm talking about the ability of the Earth to produce, plants and vegetables and fruits and, grains and legumes for us. I'm referring to soil health. I'm also talking about biodiversity loss. Who are those beings that we share this planet with? We're undergoing the nth mass extinction. There was a point in time that I was actually following. Is it the first? Is the second? Is the third? I've lost count of how much of, non-human biodiversity we've lost. And a lot of the changes that we see in the loss of biodiversity, in land use, the ability and the power of Earth to be able to give us what we need for our own sustenance, or the oceans to be able to, capture carbon and do something with it so that our Earth's atmosphere doesn't keep getting warmer and warmer. A lot of those things have been impacted by human-made systems, how we organize ourselves as a society.
And how we make decisions, right? About what our priorities are, which is why any election anywhere in the world, no matter what country you live in, because we do have listeners from all around the world, who we elect into office and their views on the ways humans are impacting the environment and the planet and the Earth are really important, right? So one of the things that I'm worried about in terms of what's currently transpiring is, of course, just all the deregulation of corporations, which the laxing of regulations around protecting the environment, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, being essentially gutted, drilling and fracking, pillaging, extracting from the Earth is only creating more loss of biodiversity. It does create more profits in the short term for corporations, which is why we're seeing the stock markets are booming right now. Anybody with their fingers on a stock portfolio right now or an equities portfolio, you've seen huge gains in the past week because of what's happening. But keep in mind, the money, the profit that many people are making are profits that are at the expense of the biodiversity and the rainforests and the oceans. When we allow corporations to run wild without having checks and balances with renewable energy and other ways to protect and save our waterways and our rivers and our natural resources, then we are paying a cost. That cost might not be in our stock portfolios right now, but the cost that we're paying is a cost that our great-great-great-great-grandchildren, if we ever have them, are paying that cost for us. So there's like a short-term gain, but there's also a long-term cost. And for me, like back to the burnout idea, the burnout that we're experiencing, I think there's many people in our communities that perhaps are burnt out by trying so hard to bring attention and awareness to how vital it is that we protect our natural resources. And I think there's a level of burnout that we're all feeling, not we all are feeling, but that many people in the community that have been fighting to protect each other and also protect the natural environment are feeling like we keep losing this battle. We keep losing the ability to communicate a message of why this is so vitally important. And so we're here again, in this space where it's not being prioritized in at least what we understand as the political agenda of what the new electorate is determining for us, right? In the United States, at least. And so how do you connect, back to the idea of the burnout, about us trying to struggle with communicating a message and the messaging related to that? Like, how is it that we have been so lost within this messaging? Why do you think we're having such a hard time connecting the dots and making a long vision about the long term and prioritizing that over short-term gains? Do you have any thoughts around why we keep falling into this trap of being so myopic in our thinking?
Well, on marketing and communication messages, I do have a lot of thoughts. I have a career in consumer brands and marketing before I transitioned to nonprofit advocacy. I would say a lot of the times when our messages is not resonating with another section of the population, it may be on account of speaking two different languages, or also experiencing burnout in many different ways, because burnout is very personal. It is universal, but also it's very personal. So for advocates like ourselves who want to advocate for a balance, that here's, yes, we understand that profit might be really important and that it is something that we've created at the heart of our economic systems, and that we don't know of another formula. But does it have to be so extractive? Does it have to come at the cost of environmental degradation or at the cost of systemic oppression of one type of person versus the other? So can we do it in a more compassionate way? Can we have purpose right along with profit so that we have balanced progress and don't kill ourselves and, march ourselves like lemmings to collective suicide, which it does feel like at this point in time. And I guess that a lot of the times when this type of messaging doesn't resonate with another section, in our case, well, looks like more than 50% of the other, part of this country, it's worth reflecting on what is the nature of their burnout and where are their pain points. Is it that they lost their jobs when a lot of manufacturing was being outsourced and offshored out of this country? Is it that the counties and the zip codes and the towns and the villages that they live in have economically completely imploded because there is no economic impetus for positive things to happen anymore? Is there joy in their lives? Is the wage and inflation deficit so large and so hard for them to bear that all that they can think of is if I can make rent, if I can go, to the grocery store and purchase fruits and vegetables or whatever it is that they want to eat, or can they save for the future? And I think that a lot of the times, when we keep focusing just on our own burnout, but not think about where the other person's burnout might be coming from, that bridge can't be developed. And then, I'm speaking a different language and all of a sudden the other person's speaking a different language. We're both burnt out in the process. And the one big role that large corporations, government or our systems or our media, for example, there's a big role and responsibility over there to ensure that conversations are happening in a manner that address everybody's burnout, right? And that we don't allow for misinformation, disinformation to kind of like fall through the cracks. And in this age of micro-targeting, if I target one message or end up reading one news outlet, it's 100% probability that more and more messaging that's going to come my way will continue to reinforce a certain message. So we could be in the same house, we could be in the same neighborhood, but we could develop an entirely opposite belief system. And then that translates into our thoughts. It translates into the worries and the fears that we have. And then it transmutes into actual decision making and civic engagement. And elections and voting is the strongest way in which democracy has taught us that we can engage in civic society.
I mean, I love that. So Nivi, in terms of the ways that we are being marketed to, and we are all in this moment, the polarization, the divide that we're experiencing, and not just in America, we see this in Europe, we're seeing fierce, extreme divides between people and their opinions, even within the same households. The marketing dollars spent on this year's US presidential election eclipsed like over $10 billion, I think, of like campaign spending. So the amount that we've also like been able to change public opinion or manipulate the way marketing and media manipulates people's views, all that can be connected to other deep desires that corporations or companies have to make their own profits, to create misinformation, as you said. What are some ways that we can create bridges and can heal between each other right now?
If there is one thought that I want to really impress upon, is to focus on the word ultra-processed. Oftentimes we think of the word ultra-processed when it comes to foods.
Right.
But really, marketing of anything, whether it's foods, whether it's services, whether it's a piece of information, marketing always does that by taking away something. So there's a process of extraction that is involved, and there's value addition to it. And there's always, after that processing, there is a packaging that is involved. And after that packaging, there is systematic way of advertising and choice of advertising platforms that are involved. So when we think of ultra processed, we have to apply that not just to foods, but also to the messaging that we've received, and is commensurate to the amount of money that the campaigns have felt that they needed to spend. There's a thought there might actually apply to healing our thought systems, is to recognize, first of all, and accept that all of the messaging that either side might have received is ultra-processed. And how do you strip it down to the whole? And the only way to do that is to engage in dialogue. The only way to do that is to put down our phones and to have a conversation face to face, is to show up in the community, regardless how offended one side might be feeling or how jubilant the other side might be feeling. It's to walk away from that processing of our own dialogue, and to realize that we're more than just conduits of the ultra-processed foods that have been fed to us, and more than just the conduits for the ultra-processed messaging that we've been fed. And to recognize that we have agency.
Yeah.
To say no and to deprocess.
Yeah.
So the way we can deprocess our lives, we can deprocess the interactions we have with people.
I love that. I mean, that's why we're having this conversation. And I love that because I'm thinking about the ultra-processed thoughts, but also the way that very few of us can escape being somehow brainwashed or conditioned from this current reality. As much as all of us want to be the ones that are like, well, I'm the one that's not brainwashed. Like everybody else is brainwashed, but not me. No, I've got my own filter and, I'm able to separate the reality from the illusion. And I feel like everyone is trying to, in some way, maintain agency over believing that their thoughts are theirs and not some thoughts that were planted in us by some other advertising mechanism, whether that's the sponsored ads on your social media feeds, whether it's the commercials that come up in between the sports games, whatever it is that's manipulating our behavior. We all, in some way, at least I feel that way, like our deepest hope and wish is that we're not being influenced by this. But I think the reality is that all of us are being influenced, and that it's really hard these days to complete your metaphor. In my mind, it's very hard these days to make your own dinner or to make lunch without ending up with some really processed foods on your plate, right? It's very hard. Like you would have to live on a farm. You'd have to like not ever go to a grocery store. You'd have to grow all your own food. Like the only way not to be brainwashed would be to live in a completely isolated, sort of solitary life where there was little to no interaction that was with the outside world. And that seems really difficult to do. And I think it's a hope that a lot of us might have that, oh, I'm special. I'm not a part of that. I'm thinking for myself. It feels in some ways we have been made to believe that we have to fight each other. We walk around with clenched fists and also clenched minds. Our minds are clenched like a fist. You know what I mean? And so because our minds are so clenched, we have no filtration system because a filter has to be like really open and wide and it has to have like spaciousness to filter through all the sentiment. But we're walking around with clenched fists and the dialogue, which you refer to, isn't happening. And the healing that has to happen right now is great. It's healing that has to happen in our interpersonal relationships. It's healing that has to happen within our communities. It's healing that has to happen with the planet and the way the species, our human species, engages and relates to the earth. All that healing is part of a big dialogue that we've been unable to have. And we are being bombarded to the point of burnout, right? So the burnout that we're all experiencing is real because how do we process all this ultra-processed information? Our capacity is diminished. And in that diminishing, we're all burned out, whether we won or whether we lost, whether we feel like we were victorious or whether we feel like we were defeated. I'm sure the feeling of burnout is real. What are some ways that we manage burnout in the world personally?
This is such an enriching conversation because I feel that sometimes the solutions are simpler, than just packing up our lives and hiding away somewhere. And that being like the only way that if I escape and if I hide away in a forest is the only way I can escape the processed, environment that I'm in, creating this burnout. And that's definitely one of the ways, but it's a privileged way. Most of us we cannot just uproot ourselves and, go away. Sometimes people can't even take a break. They may not even have the wherewithal to be able to go on a vacation, that might offer them that respite. And I don't think of this as a binary conversation. I see this as a conversation on a spectrum. Going from ultra processed to home is a journey. And it's just like for food, it's one meal at a time and one bite at a time, or one ingredient that might be whole, even if the rest of your plate still sounds and looks processed. The same way, it's potentially applicable to our thought systems. And it's about experimenting and finding what feels right for you. So if today you cannot step out and go out to a community center and meet everybody who's voted a certain way or who thinks a different way or whatever, could we start with just one person who we know that might be following a different belief and just have a conversation with them and just see how that conversation goes? Could we have a conversation with our own self? And a lot of the times, burnout isn't just a dynamic that exists between two people or between two different belief systems. Burnout is intensely personal. It's here. It's located right here. It shows up in the form of palpitations. It shows up in the form of hyperventilation, inability to breathe. And a lot of the times I have dealt with, and this is someone, who's a burnout survivor and serial burnout survivor, if I can say that, a glass of water sometimes can do the trick. Because if I am dysregulated, sure enough, I'm going to bring that dysregulation to the conversation, no matter what my intellectual intent might be. Because we're beings that pick up on energy, that's coming at us. Or people who like to say things like, oh, and then they entered the room and I felt unease, and I felt uncomfortable. I don't know. I can't put a finger on it, but there's something about that person. Or conversely, somebody entered and wow, her smile or their smile, his smile just filled up the room with sunshine, right? It's all in the perception. It's all in how regulated we feel. If you're experiencing dysregulation at this point in time, there are two elements that are best friends. One is water, if you have access to clean, potable water. And the second is your breath. The quickest, cheapest, doesn't need a Hilton or a Sheraton way for you to have a vacation from burnout is to just breathe. And if we can breathe and start to feel regulated, and if we have the intention of breaking this divide and to bridge and to bring healing and to even start to understand what the pain point of the other side might be and to engage them in that conversation. Because you know what? We can't pretend to bridge if everything that we want to bring to the conversation is about us. It has to be about the other person as well. And the capacity to help make it also about the other person, to create room for them, can only come when we're regulated. And the two things I know have helped me is water. We're 75% or more water ourselves. We don't recognize that, often enough. And the largest volume of anything that you will ingest during the day and your entire lifetime is not food. It's not water. It's not even these ultra-processed thoughts. It's air. It's breath.
It's air. It's breath. I love that. And thank you for bringing in some ideas around regulation. I think what you made me think of right now too was co-regulation, and how co-regulating is also important because we are in relationship with one another. So for me right now, the ways I've been showing up for people that are hurting and disappointed and devastated is sending texts like, hey, checking in. How are you? I'm sending you a hug. But for me, my disappointment is continuing to be connected to just the pain that's so universal. And there was a certain amount of pain that mobilized half of the population to vote for Donald Trump. Let's be really clear about that, right? And there's a certain amount of pain that's also being experienced by so many of the other half of the population that feels like the ground is slipping out from under their feet, right? The ability to feel protected, to protect the environment, to protect the climate, to protect each other. All these things are being lost. And so it's pain that is driving a lot of our behavior, right? There's a suffering that is deeply connected to how we are reacting and manifesting in the world. And so to regulate, for me, regulation is kindness, right? Sometimes it can sound like really too soft, right? Like justice is more than kindness. I think there's some sense of like, wait, kindness doesn't get us there. But in moments like these, when we have to take a pause from fighting because we're burning out, as we're talking about burnout, like fighting while you're burnt out is not going to really support you nor support the cause or the movement. As you, I've experienced burnout. I was a CEO of a nonprofit for over 2 decades. I was a nonprofit, burnt out executive leader, no energy in my battery, no fuel in my tank, And so that burnout expressed itself as anxiety, waking up really early in the morning with stress dreams. The uncertainty creates, as you mentioned, this like fear, and then you stop taking care of yourself. So forgetting to do the things that we need to do, like get some bite, like go outside, get some sunshine, go out into the park, drink a whole liter of water, make sure you're regulating your body, you're fueling your body, not with just processed foods, but with foods that are natural. So I appreciate that. I think it's good wisdom for us right now. I think there's a need for us to remind each other, of course, that we have to be kind to each other and we have to be kind to, quote unquote, the other. So like this othering is definitely a source of a lot of that pain. Regulation is really important. You've been writing a little bit about karmic debt and the karmic debt in relation to modern society. I'm very curious about this, how we fuel ourselves and what we put out into the world. I think it's all connected to this vicious karmic cycle. Are you able to reflect a little bit about your thoughts on this idea of karmic debt and our current place in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, karma is a big topic, right? And I don't know if even within the limited understanding of karma that I have even begun to scratch the surface of it. But I feel that karma is simply and simplistically put, karma is basically suggesting that what we put out, we give back. The time duration within which that boomerang effect, happens is unknowable. And sometimes it can happen instantly, which is an eye for an eye. And that's a perfect example of quick real-time karma, right?
An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind. The quote by Mahatma Gandhi.
Yes, and the outcome of it. And then sometimes it takes eons and, in almost an era, or sometimes there are generational effects, in terms of when we talk about generational curses, for instance, when we talk about epigenetic trauma, when we talk about DNA methylation that may have set in our grandparents' times because they happened to be in colonized environments, suffering from systemic oppression. And therefore, as an outcome of famine and nutritional insecurities that they experienced, that something actually changed in the DNA expression that may have then resulted in present day populations and descendants to have higher vulnerability to and susceptibility to certain chronic illnesses. That karmic debt can sometimes accumulate in that sort of a way. And so there's a scientific, very scientific, in a non-spiritual sense, an explanation for that is perfectly measurable.
Newton's third law of motion: for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
There you go. There's a physicist's point of view on karma. So a lot of the times when people talk about karma or kindness, these, as you mentioned yourself, these concepts seem really soft. And they seem that the return on investment on good karma, the return on investment on kindness, isn't going to be appropriate, to the benefit here and now that I'm looking for, or even ever in some people who might believe in different types of accountability measures or key performance indicators are different, for them. But I fervently believe that the ideas of karma and the ideas of, karmic debt and it paying out in some form or the other, whether it's positive or negative, is embedded in our way of life. It's embedded in our history. It's embedded in our culture. We just happen to call them differently with different labels. So when I talk about karmic debt in the way we fuel ourselves, it has everything to do with whatever it is that we're choosing to fuel ourselves with. And we've spoken about that in terms of the foods, the kind of beverages that we choose to fuel ourselves with, and also the thoughts and the belief systems and the ideas we choose to fuel ourselves with. And that will then determine the extent of inflammation and the inflammatory response that our bodies, that our energetic body, that our, mind, heart, soul, every single, part of us is going to experience. And that inflammation travels. It's not contagious per se, but it travels, because just like diseases travel or stay in families, they stay in families or they stay within, people that you spend time with is not necessarily genetics. It's because behavioral patterns run in families.
Right.
It's because behavioral patterns run in neighborhoods. Behavioral patterns run in certain cultures and communities.
Wow. Okay. That's deep, because now we're moving behavioral patterns, it's just my personal karmic debt. There's also a collective karma that I think is a part of what we are going to be experiencing. There's always the question of why did bad things happen to good people? And sometimes I think it's important to remember that in the midst of all the natural disasters and the hurricanes and the tsunamis and the wildfires and the flash flooding, if you're listening and you've lost your home, or you're listening and you've been, someone who has had their lives upended and devastated by some natural disaster, that's not always your personal karma that's coming home to roost. There's also an important place to understand that there's a collective stream or river of karma that's flowing, and you could just be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that all of everything that happens in karma is not about just what happens to you, but karma is also as importantly about how we respond to what is happening to us. Karma is about cultivating a skillful, wise response and having more and more mastery over our response. And so the things that happen to us, sometimes they just happen because the universe is beyond just even our comprehension. But what is cultivating our condition is our response to what is happening. So at this moment, in this critical time in the world, where the planet is burning out. There is global planetary burnout, burnout of ecosystems, burnout of Amazon rainforest is literally being burned to the ground as we are recording this podcast, right? The planet is being burned out and burnt out. And in the midst of all of that, the response that we have is really, in my opinion, it's really what is so important right now. And that response is one that requires us to cultivate a deep degree of empathy and a deep degree of compassion, not just for ourselves, because right now, if you're feeling exhausted and burnt out and tired, you need to take a beat. You need to drink your water. Like Nivi's telling us, you got to take some breath classes and spend some time outside and know that, like, don't get just caught in this one moment. Like, there's a longer game here. There's a longer vision to, like, let time also be a healer in your life. Let time heal you. And at the same time, for those of us that are ready, that there's a deep need for us to reflect on how our behavior within our homes, our neighborhoods, our communities, our nations, how it's contributing to more and more burnout. I think that's where we are. Like, how do we break this cycle of karmic debt, which I love that you're bringing this up in your work. You're researching a lot about how creative communications can address personal and planetary burnout. There's a project you're working on right now about this. I know the project is under wraps, but could you share a little teaser about the themes and the messages you plan to explore through the project around personal and planetary burnout?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for touching upon that. So the nonprofit that I created, the research-based nonprofit, and then when we did our research, qualitative research and quantitative research during the first 2 years of the pandemic, we wanted to understand during this historic window of time, how people were experiencing life, what are the choices that they were making. We centered a lot of our questions around food choices that they were making, and what was motivating them to make healthier choices. And then, given that I was also experiencing burnout at that point in time, because, as a researcher, you can put that investigative lens on other people, but you're not immune from those very themes that you research. And I realized at that point in time that it's important for us to be able to get the research out an innovative and a creative kind of a way. And not just our research, but to have other people's opinions and their expert research and a slew of different topics be involved. And why don't we actually create a creative platform to have all of that science and all of that evidence and all of that research come together in a storytelling format, in an engaging kind of a way where everybody can understand it and watch it and have some of it, hopefully stick with them and also help empower them in their decisions for the future. So all that to say that there is a creative project that is in the very late stages of post-production at this point in time. And the team is hoping that by around this time next year is when we can bring it out and birth it into the world with a lot of support that still, is needed, both financially as well as skills-wise and experts-wise. And the themes that we're touching upon in this big creative production, Hawah, is personal burnout and planetary burnout. And we're connecting the dots between these two types of, burnouts and essentially impressing upon, our audiences, our prospective audiences, that they're sides of the same coin, two sides of the same coin, and that it isn't different. That food is climate. Climate is food. My belief is actually a mirror of your belief. And even if it comes out in the way of a red vote or a blue vote, actually, some of the fundamentals are exactly the same. The pain that I'm experiencing is the same as you are, So we talk about burnout stories. We talk about expertise in burnout. We actually talk about the definition of burnout. By the way, the World Health Organization has a definition on burnout at this point in time that's woefully, it falls short of what it should be, So there's advocacy built in to really talk about how burnout needs to be more holistically defined and expanded so that diagnostics is possible. I know we need healthcare reform. I know we need healthcare access expansion, But at the same time, we need to start with at least the right definitions. Because if we don't have the right definitions, we won't be equipping our healthcare providers to even be able to spot when someone is undergoing burnout. Because just because of the range of symptoms that somebody has, right? And you shared that you had experience of burnout as an executive leader in the nonprofit sector. Now, depending on whichever specialist you could have visited, they would have a prescription. If you went to someone for a mental health concern, they would treat it differently. And if you went to somebody with, gastrointestinal upset stomach concern, they would treat it differently. And burnout is one of those big, large beasts that we're dealing with and the earth is dealing with. And this creative project seeks to connect the dots between the two and hopefully offer inspiration, empowerment, and agency for those of us who want to do something about it.
How are you personally defining burnout then? Is there a way that you're defining burnout that's different than the World Health Organization?
Well, we're actually investigating, right? And so what we did was we collected different sorts of experts and asked them, how do you define burnout from the lens of either your academic, professional training, and what you're seeing in trends and so on? So how we're defining burnout is that it is that big sense of impairment in one's agency. It's a sense of hopelessness that you experience, and it can manifest itself in so many different symptoms. And it is more than just workplace, because newer and younger demographics are complaining about burnout. They're experiencing burnout. More research is coming out. So we're definitely defining it in a more expanded form. And we expand it to the extent we talk about planetary burnout,
Yeah.
And then that takes on a very different sort of concept in and of itself, because it becomes more than just the experience of being human and experiencing burnout as an individual.
Well, and I'm so glad you said that, because the experience of being human, it transcends national borders. It transcends religious affiliation and faith. It transcends even just the physical body that I inhabit, right? The experience of being human. You've had this incredible life and career where you've traveled to over 45 countries. And in that time, you've experienced many cultural perspectives. How are you tailoring your message to resonate across these different cultural contexts, these different nations? What's the main takeaway right now from your life work up to this moment? What's the message that you have for the planet? What's the message that you have for people living around the planet that's the most important?
Yeah, for me, it is to recognize the humanity of us all, and in recognition of that beating heart. Because irrespective of the color that, I may have, or you may have, or somebody else may have, or the religion, the creed, the faith that they, subscribe to, or the language that they might be speaking, if we see tears in someone's eyes, it's not rocket science. It's even basic human, ability for us to intuitively understand, hey, something's wrong. This person's in pain, So to bring our work on burnout to other cultures, other countries, people who speak different languages, I feel is far easier, because everybody understands pain. Everyone has experienced pain. The global nature of climate change enables people to understand that, the Americans might call something a tornado, but in Bangladesh, it's called a typhoon. And they can transcend the labeling of it because of the experience and the similarity of experience that they've had to those disasters. So I feel that the big thing is just to recognize the humanity of us all, and that the recognition of burnout or pain, and equally how to heal from it, is universal.
Yeah.
We can totally do it.
Yeah. And I want to offer grace to everyone that's listening right now, like having a lot of self-compassion, because we are living in systems right now that are not designed to support us from thriving with spaciousness and with like a lot of free time. I just want to name that, like, the wheels of capitalism require deep, high levels of productivity. And the nature of many people's lives right now are requiring consistent and constant managing of family obligations, children, schooling, loans, debt, working for some people that are working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, just like it's not easy being human right now. And I just want to have like a lot of grace for everyone, all of us, that like, I think part of what I hope will happen through these conversations is we can cultivate more awareness of why it's so important to be self-compassionate, because we don't live in systems that are designed right now for us to be living in the ways that would promote our abilities to have really unselfish, generous, and even kind thinking and thoughts. We live in a world where survival of the fittest has us believing that competition is the way that we get ahead, the way that we experience happiness. And I think we've conflated happiness with this idea that getting ahead requires us to do whatever we need to do, whether that's harm the environment or harm our natural resources, our rivers, our oceans, or whether that's harm other people in our communities, because we feel sometimes the scarcity of the world as a real driving stressor that makes us, unfortunately, make decisions that are not rooted in compassion and kindness. So it's like that tension is really, like, I hold that tension, for all of us. And I feel that tension. We struggle to understand how to bridge the divide, but bridging the divide might require us to create new systems that are not rooted within the extractive ways that we are currently in relationship with each other and the planet.
Yes. And dare I say, Hawah, with your podcast, you're creating that system already. Each of us, a system doesn't have to be macro. It doesn't have to be global level. I mean, if it is and it becomes that and it scales up, awesome, because then that talks to the distributive potential of it, the reach potential of it. But like I mentioned in the post that you also mentioned before, it's blue zone, the idea of a blue zone. And obviously kudos to Dan Buettner's work at National Geographic, where blue zones originally came about as an outcome of his research. And he talks about these 9 different geographical zones where he found people to be living really long lives. He wanted to understand as to what are the factors that contributed. And then he found certain patterns that were similar between the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, California, to people in Okinawa in Japan, and that, they were eating less processed, whole, plant-based, plant-rich foods. They had community and they had connection, and there was movement and activity, bodily movement and activity in their lives, and so on. So he names at least 9 to 10 different factors. And my most recent post really spoke about the need for us to identify that some of these systems exist, and look for those blue zones. And obviously, tongue-in-cheek kind of a way, I'm metaphorically alluding to that there are blue zones, even surrounded by the reddest of the counties and the reddest of the places, in our own country, right? When you look at the map, there are these blue zones. Look at those blue zones. They are havens at this point in time of a certain ideology. And if it speaks to you, then everyone is welcome. And they're not just geographically tied. They're not just tied to a zip code. You are a blue zone. This podcast is a blue zone, Hawah. The work that you're doing, any physician who's practicing lifestyle medicine is offering that blue zone right in their clinic for every patient that walks in, or researchers, nonprofit owners, or even corporations that have a commitment to environmental goals and to create work cultures that are non-toxic. They're starting to create those blue zones. And just in the same way that selective vision brings us to distorted thinking and then those burnout triggering belief patterns, in the same way, we can deploy exactly the same selective vision to search for #compassion, hashtag Everlutionary podcast, hashtag whatever. And I'm assuming that the listeners who are either regular listeners of your podcast or the both of our work that we're doing, or people who just stumbled upon it because they were so burned out and they happened to search it on a search engine, that they would find conversations such as these as blue zone conversations.
Yeah.
And that's where healing starts to happen.
Wow. And I love that, because the blue zones, for those that are listening that don't remember, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Nivi, but my recollection of the blue zones is those are places in the world where people live to be centenarians, meaning they live to be more than 100 years old. Is that a blue zone?
Yes, exactly. This is a journalistic endeavor by a researcher and an explorer who worked with National Geographic. And his name is Dan Buettner. And he did the original research and then he published a book. And also, I think it's a Netflix series, but same name. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember watching a documentary on the blue zones a while ago. I feel like it's many years ago. But if I remember right, one of the traits of the centenarians, people that lived more than 100 years old, one of the traits was they loved learning new things. I remember seeing like a 95 or 97-year-old person that was like, I want to learn Mandarin right now, and starting to learn a brand new language while 95 years old or 97 years old, and deciding, I'm going to run a marathon. I've never ran a marathon in my life, but I want to train to run a marathon. And so the idea that learning and the desire for learning is such a hallmark sort of trait of people that live long lives. And I think it keeps the mind really agile. It keeps the mind very sticky. And it also is a great analogy and metaphor for like where we are, where you said humanity. We're at a place where knowing that we're all human, recognizing and seeing each other's humanity, I couldn't agree more. It's probably one of the most important things that we could be doing right now in the world. And part of that humanity, part of that does require us to be in a constant space of curiosity and growth mindset and knowing that I don't have all the answers. And I think that's such an important part for anybody that's part of any political party, any political affiliation, any religious, even faith. I just think there's an inquisitiveness that is critical. There's a humbleness that is required to build bridges and to build relationships where we are willing to understand each other's perspectives. And until we get there as a people, until we create these lines of communication and this hunger for humility, like until we create that, I think we're going to continue to play out these cycles of karmic debt that we were talking about earlier, because I think we get stuck in thinking that we have all the answers. And if we had all the answers, we wouldn't be where we are right now, which is not in a great place necessarily. In some ways, like, yeah, things are beautiful. I've got one of my good friends would say that now is a better time to be alive than any other time in human history. And there's some research and some books about that. I think there's also a feeling of like the world is hard to wrap your head around, right?
Yes. And, exactly at that point, it's important for us to reflect and think about how we have the capacity to hold multiple emotions. We can hold pain and we can also hold joy. We can hold a sense of loss. We can also hold a sense of victory. And it's important that we're grateful for all of those emotions. Gratitude is a glue that can actually help thread together all of those myriad emotions, because if something doesn't leave you with a lot of love, but it's the lessons, then you grow from both. We grow from love and we also grow from the lessons, Yeah. So burnout is an incredible place to think of ourselves as a seed. A seed only grows when it's planted deep inside the dark earth. You leave the seed on a kitchen counter or on the top of the ground, it's not going to grow by itself. It needs that amount of darkness. So darkness is welcome too.
Yay. Wow. I love that. Thank you for that. And thank you for this conversation. This has been very soulful and invigorating for me to just have a chance to learn so much from you and all your research and your work. Is there anything that we didn't get to, anything that you'd love to mention that I didn't get a chance to ask?
As much as a lot of the times podcast, opportunities are a place for people to come in and talk about their work. And I just feel that at this point in time, this moment, this historical moment in our country, and this point in time of world history, dialogues are important. Dialogues that are bridging dialogues, conversations that leave both people, both parties, both sides enriched and not judged. And that's what I was here for.
Yeah, I think we did that. I think we accomplished that today. And for those listening, I hope you found some sense of sanctuary, some sense of solace, and some sense of spaciousness and healing from this conversation. Go out and get some fresh air wherever you are, drink your water, go on a nice hike and take a moment, take a beat. And thank you, Nivi, for joining the podcast. Thank you for all the work you do in the world. you're a great inspiration to a lot of people. So thanks so much for being you.
You're very welcome. And thank you so much, Hawah, for everything that you're doing and for who you are.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to another episode here. I'm so grateful that you've been connecting and that you're a part of this growing community. Please remember to learn more about Nivi and any of my guests that are on my show by visiting the show notes. You can find her on social media, on Instagram and LinkedIn, and her personal website, all of which are linked in the show notes to this podcast episode. I'd also love to hear from you. So if you're inspired, if there's something that you want to talk more about or hear more about, if there's a topic you'd like to hear discussed on my show, you can shoot me a direct message on social media and let me know. You can also let me know if there's any guests that you'd love to hear on my show. Send me their names, maybe their contact information. As we transition here towards the end of the year, now we're post-election, there's a lot of nerves, a lot of anxiety. If you need some space to practice, if you need some grounding in your life, I invite you to come on one of my retreats. I've got 2 retreats in December. I've got a men's retreat from December 1st to December 5th, and then I have a silent meditation retreat from December 6th to December 10th. You can come to Massachusetts and practice in person with me. It's an incredible opportunity to learn in community, to practice self-care and mutual care. Practices are filled with mindfulness, yoga, meditation, deep breathing, pranayama practices, and deep dialogue and conversation. So please check out information, learn more, and sign up from my website. Again, all of that can be found in the show notes. And if you're inspired and you want to help me crack the algorithm, please make sure to rate this podcast and drop me a little 1 or 2 sentence review, a couple of words of why you listen and why you're tuning in. That can help go a long way. Also, you could just share this with a few friends through text message or email. Hit the share button on this podcast and send it to somebody that you think would benefit from listening to it. Remember to be kind to each other. We're moving through really palpable times, and there's a lot of polarization. And some of the best ways we can engage right now is to do little things. You can drive a little slower, you can be a little more gentle, tell somebody that you love them, be kind, be gracious, listen to each other, and let's all do our part in bringing a little bit of healing and bringing a little bit more of light back into the world. Everlutionary, restoring balance and healing the natural world, is brought to you by me, Hawah Kasat. If you would like to find out more about me and my story, head to hawah.us. That's HAWAH.US. And then make sure to search for me in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thank you for listening. Stay in touch. Peace.